you. I have to keep us to the time,
No.
or I'm going to get into trouble with our chair, who'll be back. And it just so happens it's my turn, so all the more reason to stick to time. I need to start off by declaring an interest. I'm on the Council of Management with Lord Hill, which is in the for the Ditchley Foundation, which is in the Register of Interests as well. So I've got a follow-up question in relation to Anne-Marie's question about the Inflation Reduction Act, and then I'm going to go on to the Edinburgh reforms. You talked about the scale of the US investment. The EU will come up with some response, and of course as a bloc, more resource and so on. What do you think, building on what you've already said, are there ways in which, I don't want to use the narrative of having our cake and eat it, because we haven't had much cake in the Brexit analogy, but are there ways in which we can sort of position ourselves so that we are able to work with the UK and the US and the EU, and in order to not be locked out, if you like, of what is going to be very big amounts of subsidy in investments. We're already picking up a number of other countries saying we're heading to the US in terms of sovereign wealth funds and investment, for instance, and lots of other areas. So, how do we make sure, along with the things you're talking about, what we would do, how can we make sure that we find clever ways or imaginative ways, I should say, of being able to use our relationships, particularly the US, our partnerships, what we've got of it with EU partners, to do something around that? Is there much we can do?
There's no easy answer to this at all, and I do think that the more we can align with the US on this, the better, because I think for every aspiring UK company in large degree, the US market is the one that is, if they're going to succeed, it's in the US. Mm-hmm. Europe has a difficulty for two reasons. One, the industries that are under threat, a lot of the heavy chemicals, steel industry, the motor industry and so on. Actually, a lot of the industries that we've lost in the last 20 years. And in replace of that, we have got these embryonic, high-technology, innovative industries. So I think, and we do have the capital markets, so I think we have a lot of good cards to play in this, and I think it's how we forge sectoral collaborations so that the contribution, and we Lord Hill and we talked about this a few weeks ago, is where are the competitive win-wins? Where do they exist between the UK and the US and the UK and Europe? And we have a lot to offer. And so we've got to compete on the front foot. And I don't think, and he's most definitely not competing on subsidies and incentives.
I mean, I think the point that Sir John made earlier, that the thing we've got to hand and that we ought to concentrate on is how can we try and unlock our own capital more effectively. And the anything one might seek to do diplomatically, is not certain and not short time scales, and this is happening now. So I think that's why I share his sense of urgency as to how one needs to make progress on that. I think the other thing is that it is sensible for us to double down on a particular offer. I mean, we've had quite a lot of discussion about the potential we've got with our tech offering, and we kind of need to be known for something. And that seems to me to be, listening to this discussion again, the area that we ought to be doubling down on Europe more generally. I don't see a huge amount of scope or potential for us to be doing things on the EU side that will tip the scales. I mean, I think they will have their own approach that will be more subsidy related to try to deal with the IRA. I don't think they'll get that through quickly. And I think we have to, look to ourselves and not look to others.
Well, I think I would just jump in there if I could. I spend a lot of my time as Lord Mayor travelling around talking to asset owners, sovereign wealth funds around the world, talking up the UK as a venue for investment. And there is a very strong story to tell. You know, 4 of the best 10 universities in the world, 7 of the best 20 universities in the world, extraordinarily entrepreneurial culture, so many startups, so many on the life sciences side, and fintech were really world leading. And that is absolutely recognized around the world. So I'm not seeing a shortage of capital looking to deploy itself here. What I'm very keen to do is make sure that we can have UK capital deploying itself alongside that sophisticated capital. There could be fiscal incentives.
Well, then none of you have mentioned the political turbulence we've had that has taken a hit on our reputation internationally in the last year.
Well, I go out there.
It's settling down a bit,
It is settling
but
down.
certainly has been. We've been told in no uncertain terms by certain governments when we go on delegations bluntly that actually people are going to hold off. Certain countries, sovereign funds and so on, will hold off until things settle down. Obviously, things have settled down a bit.
Maybe do you want to finish, or do you want to...
The elephant in the room.
Because I take the point. All I would maybe suggest, because Brits often at the moment, because there's a time lag on reputation, we do our self-deprecating thing of saying to people, ho ho, Britain's a bit like Italy or Greece. I mean, I think one should flip it around the other way, that we certainly had a lot of political turbulence. In the UK, we managed to replace 2 prime ministers in 3 months without a single tear gas canister being fired,
a great way of spinning
or a single head being broken by a baton.
I think you're clutching at straws there.
There are other European countries, other European countries that look a lot more unsettled than we do.
This is not from me, and they weren't making those analogies with Greece and so on, but they were very blunt. A number of countries have been very blunt, and I don't think we should get into measuring dealing with tear gas as a way of maintaining something. That's really conceding defeat. Just moving on to Edinburgh reforms. Do you feel that the Edinburgh reforms focus on the right areas with regard to stock listing, for example, changes to the prospectus regime? Who would like to? Julia, you haven't spoken, so please go.
Yes, I do, and it's partly because I think it does take those 5 component pieces, and they are actually well represented in what's in Edinburgh. I understand it's frustrating that it requires so many different pieces of the puzzle, but that is unfortunately the reality of the complex ecosystem we're talking about. One of the things I'm actually most excited about in the Edinburgh reforms is probably the thing that was last on the list, which is the idea of exploring what would be the world's first crossover venue between public and private. That is what we now call the ITV, or intermittent trading venue. It may need to change its name, given the television company's name. But that is the idea that the UK would actually be creating regulation for the first time to enable private companies to create a liquidity event for their secondary securities. That would enable angel and seed investors to get out and get back to being angel and seed investors. It would enable the very institutions that have been talked about to start following private companies for the first time. And critically, and I think this is also part of what can we do differently within the ecosystem, it would provide liquidity events for staff. So actually, if there was a UK company using that venue as a mechanism of creating liquidity for its equity, its private equity, then actually one would think that would attract more talent than a company that didn't. The other thing that's increasingly come back as we've been doing the sort of testing and the conversations about this is actually it does create that democratization of the access to private company capital as well. And to be blunt, women face a uphill challenge and getting capital for private equity investment, venture investment.
Yep.
And some of the feedback I've had from female entrepreneurs is actually that had this venue existed, they'd actually have possibly stayed private a bit longer because they'd have felt there was a level playing field by which they could operate from. So that's a sort of level of innovation in the UK that some of the things in the Edinburgh reforms have the potential to create that I think is very powerful, and I think we should keep pushing forward on.
For all of you, are there any areas where you think that the reforms go too far in terms of risking financial stability? Are there any areas where you think, we need to be careful? And if so, what are they?
Well, I used to have to do financial stability in Europe. I don't see that there's any. I mean, I think of it the other way around. It goes back to the earlier conversation about risk. We have, I think, if anything, erred too much on the side of reducing risk. Yep. So I don't see financial stability risk in any of these measures.
Yeah, I would just say that a strong regulatory system, a credible regulatory system, is an extraordinarily important underpin of a global financial centre. Yep. So there is no appetite in the City of London to see a bonfire of regulation. I think this is proportionate. What we want to see is a regulator that's agile, is able to respond quickly, and is not an obstacle to us being competitive. So I think the secondary objective of competitiveness and growth that's introduced in the Financial Services and Markets Bill is proportionate and should work well.
Lord Mayor, while I've got you, just one final question, which is in relation to where the investment goes. Do you think that there are any risks to requiring pension funds to invest in particular invest in early stage, for instance? Where should be the focus of investment? I mean, you mentioned that there is early stage investment, Sir Jonathan. It sounds like the investment is sort of the second and third stage is where you want to put funding in, and it might reassure those who are concerned about risk, particularly around pensions and so on. And going back to the point about sociology and our risk appetite, where we could reassure the public that their pension funds aren't going to be used in a way that then create problems.
I think you've always got to look at what percentage of the pension pot that you're allocating.
Yep.
The point about this is it's a high-yielding asset class. It's therefore higher risk. Yep. So you want a small proportion of the pension assets allocated to it. Yep. So that I think is fine, but I think that the point that is worth making is that we are actually quite good at seed capital. Yep. There is quite good access at the university level, which is where these companies emerge. And it's really the follow-on capital that takes place at Series A. So these companies have already sort of gone through their worst, the highest risk phase, because different investors want to play at a different part in the chain.
Yeah. So this idea that the 5%, there should be 5% mandatory fund.
No, let's move away from mandatory. 5%. 5% is sort of a guideline as to where we might end up. My personal view is that we'll see a lot of private investment go into a future growth fund. Yep. From a SIP, for instance, I would look to allocate, much more than 5% of my SIP to this because I feel very strongly that we have a real competitive advantage.
Apologies, maybe you've been misquoted by the FT.
Yes, I was.
I'd like 5% mandatory of every single DC pension.
That was some time ago when I said it's an option.
Okay. So you don't think it should be mandatory, but we need to find ways of being able to.
I don't think it'll need to be mandatory because I think it can be structured in a way that it's almost, too good to be true.
Thank you very much. I'm going to hand over to